On August 15th, 717 AD, according to both Byzantine and Arab chroniclers, 1,800 warships carrying over 100,000 warriors surrounded a single city. By August 15th, 718, exactly 1 year later, the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes claimed only 5 ships made it home. Modern historians consider this figure hyperbolic, but all sources agree. Historical records document one of history's most catastrophic military disasters and the survival of a civilization that should have been extinct. Think about those numbers for a second. 1,800 ships, over 100,000 men. Contemporary sources, both Christian and Muslim, agree on the scale. The Umayyad Caliphate, stretching from Spain to India, had mobilized the largest invasion force the medieval world had ever seen. Their target, Constantinople, defended by perhaps 20,000 men behind walls that had never been breached. The fate of Christian Europe hung by a thread so thin it was invisible. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented historical sources reveal the most unlikely survival in medieval history. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see medieval warfare forever. First, the grain deception recorded in Byzantine chronicles that turned certain defeat into survival before the siege even began. Second, why the Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir called this, quote, 0-third, the technological secret weapon that Byzantine sources describe making water itself burn. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did a usurper emperor who'd betrayed his allies just months earlier organize a defense that saved Western civilization? What tactical weapon, shrouded in state secrecy for centuries, could destroy ships faster than men could pray? Why did one of history's most severe winters strike at exactly the moment the defenders needed it? How could seasoned warriors who'd conquered from Spain to Persia starve outside the richest city in Christendom? How could an entire fleet, 1,800 ships, simply vanish in a single storm? This is the story of Leo the Liar versus Maslama the Sword of Islam. To understand how impossibility became reality, we need to step back to 717 AD, when the Byzantine Empire was preparing for the end. The year 717 AD marked what Byzantine scholars called the darkest hour, the point where historical records suggest the empire had accepted its own extinction. For 22 years, the Byzantine state had torn itself apart. 7 emperors, 7 violent regime changes, 0 stability. Modern historians call this period the 20 Years' Anarchy. And Theophanes, the Confessor's Chronicle, describes an empire convinced their sins had brought divine punishment in the form of relentless Arab expansion. The state apparatus was fractured. The military was demoralized. The psychological siege had begun long before any army appeared at the gates. Byzantine chronicles describe a people who believed they were watching the end of their world. The great fortresses that once dominated the landscape were falling one by one to a resurgent Islamic empire. United under Umayyad rule, Damascus commanded an empire that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of India in the east. This wasn't just political expansion. Arab sources make clear this was ideological conquest with messianic overtones. The capture of Constantinople, the city of Caesar, was viewed as prophetic fulfillment, the ultimate triumph that would mark Islam's destiny. Contemporary sources document the power imbalance with brutal clarity. The Crusader states, scattered across the Levant, could perhaps muster 15,000 men total if every fortress emptied. The Umayyad Caliphate commanded over 100,000 warriors with the wealth of Egypt, funding endless campaigns. Military historians examining the period agree. This wasn't a question of if the Byzantine Empire would fall. But when? Constantinople's nobles made secret preparations for exile. Ships waited in the ports. Treaties were quietly negotiated with potential protectors. The smart money said the kingdom had months at most. Theophanes records that Emperor Theodosius III, occupying a throne he barely controlled, watched the empire crumble without apparent power to stop it. Yet, something else was stirring in those desperate months of early 717. On the frontiers where Byzantine territory met Arab conquest, a rough soldier from the borderlands was playing a game far more dangerous than anyone in Constantinople's gilded halls could imagine. His name was Leo, and he was about to prove that sometimes the greatest threat to an empire comes from the man who claims to save it. The man who would save Christian civilization was, according to contemporary records, a traitor, a liar, and a usurper. His name was Leo, and he was exactly what the empire needed. Theophanes and other Byzantine sources document Leo's rise from obscurity with a mixture of admiration and unease. Born around 685 in Commagene on the Syrian frontier, originally named Conon, he came from humble origins that left no mark in the historical record until his military brilliance forced chroniclers to notice. He rose through the ranks to become strategos of the Anatolikon theme, the military governor of one of Byzantium's most critical defensive zones. What made Leo dangerous wasn't just his tactical skill. It was his intimate knowledge of the enemy. Decades on the Arab-Byzantine frontier had given him something few Byzantine nobles possessed. He spoke Arabic fluently, understood Arab culture deeply, and knew their military psychology from the inside. Medieval sources describe him as a master of métis, that Greek concept of cunning intelligence that values the indirect approach over brute force. This wasn't a traditional hero. This was a trickster figure, a man who won through deception when strength failed. In March of 717, as Maslama's invasion force gathered in Syria, Leo made his move. Chronicles record him marching on Constantinople not to defend it from the Arabs, but to seize it from Emperor Theodosius III. The usurpation was swift and bloodless. Theodosius, perhaps recognizing he lacked the strength to resist, or perhaps simply exhausted by the burden of ruling a dying empire, retired to a monastery without a fight. On March 25th, 717, Leo was crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia. The coronation must have seemed surreal to Constantinople's elite. This rough soldier emperor from the borderlands, only 32 years old, standing where emperors of ancient lineage had stood, wearing the purple that his hands had quite literally stolen. Byzantine sources describe him as having the bearing of a frontier general, not the refined manners of court. He would wear the imperial regalia, but his demeanor remained martial, practical, focused. What the nobles watching that coronation didn't know, what would only become clear in the months ahead, was that Leo had already been playing a far more dangerous game. He had negotiated with the very army now marching toward their gates. He had made promises to Maslama, and he had absolutely no intention of keeping them. Theodosius III retired to his monastery without protest. The nobles who'd spent weeks preparing for exile watched in shock as this frontier nobody seized absolute power. They had no idea Leo had already been lying to the deadliest army on earth. What happened next would reveal whether his cunning was genius or fatal miscalculation. Facing this cunning usurper stood the most successful Muslim general of his generation, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, brother of the Caliph, governor of Mesopotamia, the man Arab sources called the Sword of the Caliphate. Historical records document a resume that would have intimidated any opponent. Maslama was born around the same time as Leo, approximately 685, but into circumstances of unimaginable privilege. His father was Caliph Abd al-Malik. His brother was the reigning Caliph Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik. He governed Mesopotamia and Armenia, commanding the loyalty of Syria's military elite. Arab chronicles describe decades of victory. The capture of Tiana in 708, the sack of Amasya, the systematic dismantling of Byzantine defenses across Anatolia. This was a general who had never known defeat. Theophanes and Arab sources agree on Maslama's reputation. He wasn't just competent. He was the premier military commander of the Umayyad state. Byzantine fortresses that had held for generations fell when Maslama arrived. His very name could empty garrisons. He combined genuine military skill with the confidence that comes from unbroken success and royal backing. But historical analysis suggests Maslama carried something more dangerous than mere confidence. Prophetic belief. Islamic tradition held that the conquest of Constantinople was divinely ordained, and historians examining the period note that Maslama appears to have believed his name was associated with that prophecy's fulfillment. This wasn't just military ambition. This was sacred destiny. The campaign he prepared for in 717 reflected that conviction. Contemporary sources document the mobilization of resources on a scale unprecedented in medieval warfare. This wasn't a raid, one of the seasonal incursions that had harassed Byzantine borders for decades. Arab historians make clear this was a grand campaign designed for permanent occupation. The Caliphate was preparing to decapitate the Byzantine Empire and absorb Europe into the Islamic world. Maslama would command an army that Arab sources describe as capable of conquering the world. He would ride under the white banners of the Umayyad dynasty, resplendent in gilded armor that mixed late Sasanian and Arab styles, the very image of Islamic military might at its zenith. For nearly a decade, he had crushed every Byzantine force sent against him. His reputation alone could induce surrender. In 716, as he marshaled the largest army the Islamic world had ever assembled, victory seemed not just probable, but inevitable. The mathematics were undeniable. The prophecy was clear. God's favor was assured. What he couldn't know was that the greatest threat wouldn't come from Constantinople's walls. It would come from a frontier general he thought was his ally, a man who had already begun the most audacious deception of the medieval age. In the dusty plains of Anatolia, 716 AD, contemporary chronicles describe how Maslama's army had Byzantine general Leo cornered. The fortress of Amorium was surrounded. Surrender seemed inevitable. What happened next, according to Theophanes, was one of history's most audacious cons. Maslama was securing his supply lines for the coming assault on Constantinople. Amorium was a critical fortress in the Anatolikon theme, and Leo commanded its garrison. The tactical situation was clear. Maslama had the numbers, the supplies, and the momentum. Leo was outnumbered and apparently trapped. Medieval military logic said he should surrender or prepare for a long, losing siege. Instead, Theophanes records, Leo did something that would define his entire reign. He negotiated. Chronicles describe Leo riding out to meet Maslama personally, using his command of Arabic and his knowledge of frontier customs to gain an audience. The offer he presented was extraordinary. Leo claimed he wanted to overthrow Emperor Theodosius III. If Maslama would spare Amorium and help him, Leo would hold the Byzantine Empire as a tributary to the Caliphate. He would hand over the keys to Constantinople without a drop of blood spilled. Maslama, according to the sources, was intrigued. The prospect of bloodless conquest through a puppet emperor aligned perfectly with efficient military strategy. He agreed to spare Amorium if the garrison surrendered and provided supplies to his army. Here's where Theophanes provides the specific mechanism of the deception. Leo requested that Maslama's cavalry pull back from the immediate area to allow his men to gather grain from the fields and outlying villages, ostensibly to hand over to the Arab forces as tribute. The Arab commanders, seeing this as a gesture of good faith, agreed. They watched as Leo's men worked for days, moving grain in wagons and on pack animals. What they didn't realize until too late was the direction. Leo wasn't taking grain out of the fortress to give to Maslama. He was moving grain into the citadel from the surrounding countryside. While the Arabs waited for their supplies, Leo was stockpiling amorium for an extended siege. Once every last bushel of grain was safely behind the walls, he garrisoned 800 of his elite soldiers inside and secured the gates. Then he sent a message to Maslama that Theophanes summarizes with devastating simplicity. Quote 2. Arab sources describe Maslama's fury. He had been played. The man who'd promised to hand over an empire had instead secured a massive Byzantine stronghold in Maslama's rear. The fortress that should have surrendered was now stocked for a year-long siege. Any competent siege would cost weeks and thousands of men. Maslama, already on a timeline to reach Constantinople before winter, couldn't afford it. He was forced to bypass Amorium, leaving a fully garrisoned, well-supplied Byzantine fortress sitting astride his supply lines. It was a strategic disaster born of trusting the wrong man. But it was also something more personal. Maslama had been humiliated. The sword of the caliphate had been made to look like a fool by a frontier general using the oldest trick in warfare, pretending to surrender while preparing to resist. When Leo marched on Constantinople 3 months later and seized the throne, Maslama's calculations shifted. This wasn't just conquest anymore. This was personal. The liar would pay. By the time summer arrived in 717, Maslama's army was already gathering. The campaign would proceed as planned. But now, woven through military necessity and prophetic conviction, ran a thread of vengeance. As Leo consolidated his stolen throne in spring 717, intelligence reports brought terrifying news. The caliphate wasn't sending a raid. Historical records document the mobilization of resources on a scale the medieval world had never witnessed. Theophanes provides numbers that modern historians have spent centuries debating, but the scale is undeniable. Arab chronicles confirm Maslama was assembling what they called underscore. Quote _3 underscore, the estimates range from 80,000 to 120,000 warriors, drawn from across the entire Islamic empire. The corps consisted of 30 to 40,000 Syrian Arabs, the elite troops whose loyalty to the Umayyad dynasty was unquestioned. Supporting them were Mawali, non-Arab converts, including Persians and Berbers, along with contingents from every province of the caliphate. This wasn't simply a large army. Military historians examining the period emphasize this was a cosmopolitan war machine representing the full might of an empire that stretched 3 continents. These were warriors who had conquered from Spain to India. They wore armor influenced by both Byzantine and Sasanian traditions. Heavy mail hauberks, often reinforced with lamellar, conical, or rounded helmets, frequently wrapped in turbans. Straight double-edged swords, rather than the curved scimitars of later periods. They carried the confidence of men who believed God fought on their side. But the land forces were only half the terror. Contemporary sources, both Christian and Muslim, cite 1,800 ships assembling in the eastern Mediterranean. This fleet represented perhaps the largest naval mobilization of the medieval period. Heavy transport dhows from Egypt, capable of carrying months of supplies. War galleys designed to dominate the sea lanes. Supply vessels packed with everything an army would need for an extended campaign. The crews numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn primarily from Egypt and North Africa. Critically, as would later prove decisive, many of these sailors were Coptic Christians who had been forcibly conscripted into service. They rowed and sailed under compulsion, not conviction. Theophanes describes the supply train stretching for miles behind Maslama's advancing columns. This wasn't the logistics of a seasonal raid. This was preparation for permanent occupation. The Caliphate had emptied its treasury for this campaign. The quantities involved suggested confidence in a siege that might last years if necessary. Damascus was betting everything that Constantinople would fall. The strategic objective, as Arab sources make clear, was nothing less than total war. This was the grand campaign that would decapitate the Byzantine Empire and open all of Europe to Islamic conquest. Where previous incursions had been probing attacks or punitive raids, this was designed to permanently eliminate the Byzantine barrier to European expansion. Military historians analyzing Umayyad strategy note this represented a fundamental shift from opportunistic raiding to systematic conquest. By late summer 717, as Maslama's endless columns began their march toward Constantinople, every military calculation pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. The city would fall. The numbers were overwhelming. The supplies were adequate. The leadership was proven. The prophecy was clear. But calculations don't account for deception, technology, or winter. And Constantinople possessed all three. Constantinople wasn't just a city. According to contemporary Byzantine sources, it was the new Rome, the city protected by God. And its defenses were as much spiritual as physical. Archaeological evidence and historical records document defensive works unmatched in the medieval world. The Theodosian walls, constructed in the 5th century, had never been breached in over 300 years. This wasn't merely military propaganda. It was verifiable fact that shaped the psychology of both defenders and attackers. The walls consisted of a triple defensive system: a 60-foot wide moat, a low outer wall, and a massive inner wall studded with 96 towers. These weren't just stone barriers. They were a statement of invincibility that had withstood every siege for 3 centuries. Geography reinforced what engineering had built. The city occupied a triangular peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water. The Golden Horn protected the northern approach. The Bosphorus guarded the east. The Sea of Marmara secured the south. Only from the west could a land army approach. And there, the Theodosian walls stood unbroken. Any naval assault would have to contend with treacherous currents and Byzantine naval supremacy in waters they'd controlled for centuries. Byzantine engineering sources describe one defensive feature that would prove critical: the Great Chain of the Golden Horn. This was no ordinary chain. It consisted of massive iron links, each the size of a man's forearm, supported by wooden pontoons floating on the water's surface. The chain stretched from the Tower of Eugenius on the Constantinople side to the Tower of Castellion in the suburb of Galata. Teams of men and oxen operated windlass mechanisms that could raise the chain to block entry or lower it to allow friendly ships passage. When raised, it transformed the Golden Horn into an impregnable safe harbor. When lowered, it became a gateway Byzantine forces could exploit. But Theophanes makes clear the defenders believed their ultimate protection was divine, not merely physical. The city had survived for over 3 centuries, not simply because of walls and chains, but because God willed it. Icons of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, were paraded along the battlements as spiritual weapons. Contemporary sources describe Constantinople in 717 as a theocracy in a fortress, where constant prayer vigils in the Hagia Sophia created an atmosphere of apocalyptic piety. The people believed their survival depended as much on the Virgin's favor as on their soldiers' swords. The contrast between Byzantine and Arab worldviews was absolute. Both sides believed God fought for them. Both saw this conflict in cosmic terms. Theophanes records Byzantine conviction that their walls had never fallen because divine protection made them unconquerable. Arab sources reveal Islamic confidence that their expansion had never failed because Allah's will drove them forward. In August 717, as Maslama's endless columns appeared on the horizon like a storm made of men and steel, these two theological certainties would collide. The golden mosaics of Constantinople glittered behind massive limestone walls. Beyond them stretched an ocean of Arab tents, siege engines, and confident warriors. The arithmetic said the walls would fall. History said they never had. Faith said God would decide. One of these convictions was about to shatter. August 15th, 717 AD. Theophanes the Confessor records the moment Maslama's army arrived at Constantinople's land walls as a vision from the apocalypse itself. The visual confrontation was staggering. Contemporary chronicles describe an endless sea of Arab tents filling the horizon, siege towers being assembled, mangonels positioned for bombardment. The banners of Islam, white Umayyad standards mixed with the colors of a dozen provinces, stretched as far as defenders on the walls could see. Behind the limestone barriers, Constantinople's golden domes caught the August sun. The contrast embodied the clash. Christian civilization's greatest city versus the Islamic world's mightiest army. Maslama's initial strategy was conventional. Historical accounts document assault attempts using ladders and battering rams against the western walls. Byzantine defenders, positioned along the towers and battlements, repelled these probing attacks with archery volleys and stone throwers. The assaults served their purpose. They tested the defenses and confirmed what military logic had already suggested. The Theodosian walls could not be taken by force. Medieval siege warfare had well-established protocols for this situation, and Theophanes describes Maslama following them with professional competence. Recognizing that assault was futile, he ordered the construction of circumvallation, defensive siege works that would strangle the city through starvation, rather than storm it through violence. The engineering was sophisticated. Arab forces constructed a double line of walls and ramparts outside Constantinople. One line faced the city to prevent sorties by the defenders. The other faced outward to defend against external relief forces. This was textbook Roman siegecraft, and it demonstrated that Islamic military engineering had absorbed and mastered the techniques of their Byzantine enemies. The circumvallation would cut off land supply routes, while the fleet, still days away, would complete the blockade by severing the sea lanes. Maslama settled in for a patient siege. His army, supplied by the wealth of the entire caliphate, could wait months or even years. The camp that sprang up outside the walls became a city unto itself, with markets, mosques, and vast corrals for thousands of animals. Contemporary accounts suggest a confidence bordering on certainty. The siege works were built to last. The supplies were adequate for an extended campaign. Time, hunger, and inevitability would accomplish what assault could not. Inside the walls, Leo faced a calculation that would have broken most commanders. Without resupply, the city had perhaps weeks of food. The Muslim fleet would arrive any day to complete the stranglehold. The land routes were already cut. Simple arithmetic suggested Constantinople would starve long before Maslama's well-supplied army showed any signs of weakness. By nightfall on August 15th, the siege works were begun. Maslama had demonstrated textbook military professionalism. He'd tested the defenses, recognized their strength, and adapted to a strategy that leveraged his overwhelming advantages in numbers and supplies. His army could wait months. Constantinople could not. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The city would starve. But Maslama had made one critical miscalculation about the Bosphorus, and it would cost him everything. September 1st, 717. The Arab fleet, 1,800 ships according to both Byzantine and Muslim sources, sailed past Constantinople into the Bosphorus to cut off the city's Black Sea grain supply. What happened 48 hours later would become the stuff of nightmares. Theophanes provides detailed accounts of the fleet's arrival. These weren't just war galleys. The Arab armada included heavy transport dhows built for carrying supplies, war galleys designed for combat, and support vessels for an extended campaign. The sheer scale of the fleet, modern historians debate exact numbers, but sources consistently cite 1,800, represented perhaps the largest naval force assembled in the medieval period up to that point. The Arab admirals made a fatal tactical error that contemporary sources document with clarity. Unfamiliar with the treacherous currents of the Bosphorus, they allowed their heavy ships to drift too close to the city walls near the Acropolis point. The vessels became clustered and immobile, their crews assuming they were safely out of range of Byzantine defenses. They were positioned to blockade the strait, cutting off Constantinople's access to Black Sea grain. The strategy was sound. The execution would prove catastrophic. Leo III seized the moment. Byzantine sources record him ordering the great chain of the Golden Horn lowered. Teams working the windlass mechanisms allowed the massive iron barrier to sink beneath the surface. A squadron of Byzantine dromons, specialized warships designed for speed and maneuverability, rowed out from the protected harbor into open water. Arab crews, trained in Mediterranean naval warfare, expected a boarding action. They prepared for the clash of ships, hand-to-hand combat, the familiar brutal chaos of naval melee. What they faced instead was something for which no training or experience had prepared them: Greek fire. Byzantine sources describe the weapon with a mixture of technical precision and awe. The dromons mounted bronze siphons on their prows, tubes through which a liquid substance was pumped under pressure. Heated by braziers at the nozzles, the liquid ignited as it sprayed, creating a coherent jet of flame that could reach 10 to 15 meters. Modern theories suggest the composition involved naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, and resin, though the exact formula remains a lost Byzantine state secret. The effect on the clustered Arab ships was immediate and catastrophic. Theophanes records 20 massive Arab transports incinerated in the attack. But the true horror lay in Greek fire's properties. The substance was sticky like modern napalm. It floated on water, and water didn't extinguish it. In many cases, water spread the flames across the surface of the sea. Contemporary accounts describe Arab sailors jumping overboard to escape the burning ships, only to find themselves swimming through fire. The substance clung to skin and wood alike, burning with a black, oily smoke that chroniclers say could be seen for miles. The screaming, the smell of burning flesh and pitch, the sight of the sea itself aflame. Sources on both sides record this as a vision of hell made real. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. Arab naval commanders had never encountered anything like this. Their experience included decades of Mediterranean warfare, battles against Byzantine fleets, knowledge of every conventional naval tactic. But this violated everything they knew about combat. Fire that water couldn't quench was beyond nature, beyond warfare, beyond comprehension. The surviving Arab ships scattered in panic. Theophanes documents them retreating to Sostinion on the European shore. well away from the city's reach. The fleet that was supposed to complete the blockade had been shattered before it could establish control of the strait. The strategic consequence was immediate and profound. The Bosphorus remained open. Constantinople could still receive grain from the Black Sea. The city that should have been strangled now had a lifeline. Meanwhile, Maslama's land forces, cut off from their own naval supply line, faced an ironic reversal. The besiegers were becoming isolated while the besieged maintained supply. In 3 hours, the largest fleet ever assembled to conquer Constantinople had been shattered by perhaps 50 Byzantine warships. The technological advantage Arab commanders had never even imagined existed had just rewritten the siege's entire strategic calculus. Maslama, watching from the land walls as his fleet burned and scattered, faced a terrifying reality. His army was now trapped between impregnable walls and an enemy who could make the sea itself burn. December 717 brought what Theophanes called a winter of unnatural cold. Modern climate studies confirm it. The winter of 717 to 718 was one of the most severe in recorded European history. For the Byzantines behind their walls, it was providence. For Maslama's army, it was the beginning of hell. Contemporary sources document weather that seemed apocalyptic. Snow covered the ground for over 100 days, extraordinary for a region where winter snow typically melts within days. Temperatures plunged far below normal for the Mediterranean climate. Theophanes records conditions so severe that the Bosphorus itself began to freeze, a phenomenon so rare that it stood as evidence of divine intervention in Byzantine minds. The frozen strait created surreal and terrifying scenes. Ice floes from the Black Sea clogged the waterway, massive chunks of ice smashing into ships and seawalls. Byzantine sources describe soldiers walking on the ice, an image that captured the unnatural severity of the cold. Modern climate researchers examining the period suggest possible volcanic activity creating atmospheric dust that contributed to the extreme temperatures. What scientists call a volcanic winter. Whether divine punishment or natural catastrophe, the effect on the siege was undeniable. For Maslama's army, the winter marked a descent from confidence into desperation. Arab supply lines through Anatolia, already stretched thin across hundreds of miles, came under increasing harassment from Byzantine raiders who knew the terrain. The naval supply route, compromised by Greek fire and now further complicated by ice and winter storms, couldn't deliver adequate provisions. The camp that had seemed so well supplied in August faced shortages by December. Theophanes provides a detailed chronicle of the famine's progression that modern historians debate as possibly exaggerated, but fundamentally accurate. The first phase saw the systematic slaughter of transport animals. Arab warriors ate their camels first, the beasts that had carried supplies across deserts from Egypt to Syria. The meat was tough but sustaining. When the camels were gone, they consumed their horses. Arab cavalry, the elite of Islamic military might, watched their mounts being butchered for food. After the horses came the donkeys, every pack animal that had survived the march. By late January, contemporary accounts document an Arab camp that had consumed every large animal. The sounds of the siege had changed. No longer the clang of weapons being maintained or the bustle of a confident military encampment. Now it was the desperate chopping of frozen wood for fuel, the wailing of sick men, the silence of those too weak to make noise. Inside Constantinople, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Byzantine sources don't describe starvation in the city. A telling silence. The advanced infrastructure that had sustained the capital for centuries continued to function. Massive cisterns, like the Basilica cistern, held thousands of cubic meters of fresh water brought by aqueducts from the Belgrade forest. Even if the aqueducts were cut, stored water could last for years. The Bosphorus, despite the ice, remained partially navigable. Ships still brought grain from the Black Sea through the strait. Roman traditions of hygiene, maintained through public baths and water distribution systems, helped prevent the disease outbreaks that typically ravaged besieged cities. Morale inside the walls was sustained by religious fervor and adequate supplies. The constant prayer vigils continued. Icons were paraded daily. The people believed they were witnessing divine protection made manifest. Every day the Arab army grew weaker, while Constantinople maintained its strength seemed to confirm what faith had promised. God protected his city. By late January, the Arab camp had consumed every camel, every horse, every donkey. Medieval sources document what happened next with descriptions that test the limits of credibility. Yet, the desperation was undeniably real. When the meat ran out, Theophanes records, men would eat things that should never be eaten. The worst was yet to come. What Theophanes records next tests the limits of human endurance and historical credibility. The Byzantine chronicler, writing decades later, described scenes so horrific that modern historians actively debate whether they're literal truth, propaganda exaggeration, or some combination. What's not debatable is that Arab sources themselves admit the catastrophe, even as they spare the gruesome details Theophanes provides. Chronicles document the next phase of starvation with details that shock even across 13 centuries. With all large animals consumed, Arab warriors turned to whatever could be found. They ate plant roots dug from frozen ground. They consumed old leather, saddles, boots, anything made from hide was boiled until it could be chewed. Water mixed with sawdust and any scrap of organic matter became a gruel that provided calories, if not nutrition. Then, according to Theophanes' account, came the unspeakable. He claims bodies of the dead were consumed. Modern historians debate this as possible propaganda exaggeration designed to emphasize Arab suffering and Byzantine divine protection. Yet the claim appears in sources and reflects the extreme desperation of the situation. The most horrific allegation, that excrement was mixed with leaven to make a substance resembling bread, may represent Byzantine propaganda at its most lurid, but it served to communicate the absolute collapse of normal human society in the Arab camp. What's verifiable beyond chronicle accounts is the disease outbreak. Medieval medical history shows that cold combined with malnutrition creates conditions for catastrophic pestilence. Theophanes records dysentery, what medieval sources called the bloody flux, killing thousands of men. Exposure claimed as many lives as disease. Historians examining siege warfare patterns confirm this matches typical conditions. In medieval sieges, disease and starvation killed far more than combat. The burial crisis added horror to horror. Frozen ground made digging graves impossible. Contemporary sources describe bodies being stacked in ravines or simply left in the open where they fell. The winter snow preserved the corpses, hiding the full scale of death until the spring thaw would reveal the graveyard the camp had become. The stench, normally overwhelming in a medieval military camp, was frozen along with everything else. But come spring, the decomposition would poison the air and water sources that remained. Arab chroniclers, when they address this period at all, use euphemism and theological interpretation. They speak of hardship sent by God to test faith. They admit massive suffering without providing the visceral details that Byzantine sources relish. The difference in tone suggests truth lies somewhere between Theophanes' lurid propaganda and Arab reticence. The camp experienced catastrophic conditions. Whether every specific horror occurred exactly as described is uncertain. That tens of thousands died is not. Inside Constantinople, life continued with relative normalcy that must have seemed miraculous to those who watched from the walls. The cisterns provided clean water. The grain ships from the Black Sea, though reduced in number by winter and ice, still arrived. Disease remained minimal because Byzantine infrastructure maintained basic sanitation. Morale stayed high because every day that passed demonstrated divine favor. The Virgin's protection wasn't just theological claim, it was visible reality. By March 718, Maslama had lost more men to winter than to any battle in his career. Contemporary sources suggest tens of thousands dead, though exact figures are impossible to verify. His quote six had become a graveyard with standards. Any reasonable commander would have retreated months earlier. The sunk costs were irrelevant compared to the living disaster the siege had become. Yet Maslama stayed. Was it the prophecy he believed connected his name to Constantinople's conquest? The sunk cost of so much death making retreat psychologically impossible? Fear of facing the caliph with the greatest military disaster in Islamic history? Sources don't tell us his reasoning. What they do tell us is that in spring, he would make one final desperate gamble to salvage victory from catastrophe. It would backfire with devastating completeness. Spring 718 brought what looked like salvation for Maslama's dying army. Theophanes records the arrival of two massive relief fleets, 400 ships from Alexandria, 360 from North Africa, carrying food, weapons, and hope. Within weeks, that hope would turn to ashes, betrayed from within. The numbers tell the story of caliphal commitment. 760 additional ships represented an enormous mobilization of naval resources. Contemporary sources document these vessels carrying desperately needed supplies: grain from Egypt's fertile Nile Delta, weapons from Damascus's armories, fresh warriors to replace the tens of thousands lost to winter. The relief expedition suggested that despite the catastrophe, the Umayyad leadership remained committed to Constantinople's conquest. Critically, the crews manning these ships were largely Coptic Christians who had been forcibly conscripted from Egypt. This detail, documented in both Byzantine and Arab sources, would prove decisive. The Copts were Christians who had lived under Islamic rule since the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. While generally treated with the tolerance Islamic law required for quote 7, they remained second-class subjects. Forced naval service was one of the burdens their communities bore. The fleet commanders, wary of Greek fire after the September disaster, exercised tactical caution that Theophanes describes in detail. Rather than sail directly to Constantinople where Byzantine dromons could attack, the ships anchored on the Asian side of the Bosphorus, hiding in the protected bays near Nicomedia. This positioning kept them well away from the city's reach, while allowing them to eventually ferry supplies to Maslama's camp via protected routes. What happened next, according to Byzantine sources, was an act of religious solidarity that shattered Arab hopes. Under cover of darkness, Coptic sailors seized the ship's small boats, the skiffs and light craft used for ship-to-shore transport. Chronicles record them rowing across the Bosphorus under night's concealment, approaching Constantinople's sea walls, and hailing the imperial guards with shouts that Theophanes preserves. Long live the emperor! The defectors brought intelligence that proved invaluable. They revealed the exact location of the hidden Arab supply fleet in the Nicomedia bays. They described the ship's positioning, the number of vessels, the level of alertness among the guards. They provided navigation details for reaching the Asian shore through waters Byzantine sailors knew well, but that would be treacherous in darkness without local knowledge. Leo III moved with the speed that had characterized his entire reign. Byzantine sources document him arming his dromons with Greek fire and assembling crews for a night attack. Guided by the Coptic defectors who knew precisely where their former fleets lay at anchor, the Byzantine squadron crossed the strait to the Asian side. The Arab supply ships, stationary and unprepared in what their commanders had believed was a safe anchorage, faced the same horror their main fleet had experienced in September. Greek fire turned night into day, and the sea into an inferno. Theophanes records the systematic destruction of the relief fleet. The supplies meant to save Maslama's army, grain that could have fed them for months, weapons to replace those lost or damaged, fresh provisions for men who'd been eating roots and worse, were sent to the bottom of the sea or consumed by flames that water couldn't quench. The psychological impact rivaled the material loss. Maslama had endured winter's horror with the knowledge that relief was coming. Spring would bring salvation. The new supplies would reverse the catastrophe. Fresh troops would restore fighting capability. The siege could continue with renewed strength. Instead, he watched from the European shore as the flames rose once again from the Asian side. First, his main fleet in September. Now his relief fleet in May. The Caliphate had sent nearly 2,600 ships to Constantinople. Greek fire and betrayal had destroyed them. The spring that should have brought victory had brought only more death. Arab chronicles from this period show signs of theological crisis. How could this be God's will? The prophecies promised conquest. The largest military effort in Islamic history had been mounted. Yet every attempt ended in fire and failure. Some sources suggest commanders began questioning whether divine favor had shifted, whether some unknown sin had caused Allah to withdraw his support. Summer would bring something worse than fire or winter. The Bulgarians. As summer heat replaced winter cold in July 718, Maslama faced a new crisis. Khan Tervel of Bulgaria, the Caesar given his title by Byzantium decades earlier, had decided Constantinople's survival served Bulgarian interests. Historical records document what happened when steppe warfare met exhausted siege lines. The Bulgarian alliance had deep roots. Byzantine sources record that in 705, Tervel had helped the deposed Emperor Justinian II regain his throne. As reward, he'd been granted the title Caesar, Caesar in Greek, making him the first foreign ruler to receive this honor. This meant Tervel considered himself part of the imperial hierarchy, not simply a barbarian outsider. When Leo negotiated for help in 718, he was appealing to an established, if complicated, relationship. Tervel's motivations were pragmatic rather than ideological. Historical analysis suggests he recognized that an Arab victory would make Bulgaria the next target. Constantinople's walls had stopped Islamic expansion. If those walls fell, nothing stood between Maslama's army and Bulgarian territory. The trade concessions Leo offered were attractive, but survival dictated involvement regardless of payment. The Bulgarians brought a warfare style completely different from the siege combat that had dominated the previous year. Bulgarian military studies document them as a steppe people with Turkic roots. They were masters of mobile warfare, swift horse archers who could appear, strike, and vanish before heavy infantry or siege troops could respond. They wore lamellar armor and heavy furs, carried composite bows of devastating power, and rode under horsetail standards that marked their Central Asian heritage. Theophanes describes their campaign with admiration for tactical acumen. The Bulgarians did not attack Maslama's main siege lines head-on. That would have been suicide against fortified positions manned by professional soldiers. Instead, they used their mobility to ambush foraging parties. Any group of Arab soldiers sent to find food or fuel in the countryside became targets for swift cavalry attacks. More devastatingly, Bulgarian horse archers cut off the rear of Maslama's camp. The Arab forces found themselves in a trap of their own making. In front stood Constantinople's impregnable walls. Behind, Bulgarian cavalry controlled the countryside. The siege lines designed to starve the city had become a prison for the besiegers. The casualty figures from this phase show the effectiveness of the Bulgarian campaign. Western chronicles claim 300,000 total Arab casualties for the entire siege. A number modern historians recognize as impossible exaggeration. But scholarly analysis of the Bulgarian intervention specifically suggests 22,000 to 30,000 Arab dead from these attacks alone represents a credible estimate. These weren't casualties from single battles, but cumulative losses from weeks of constant harassment, ambushes, and the cutting of supply lines. Arab sources, when they address this period, convey a sense of nightmare made real. Men who'd survived winter starvation now faced mounted archers who struck without warning. Foraging became a death sentence. The camp that had already suffered unimaginable losses bled more with each day. Morale, already shattered by winter and the burning fleets, collapsed entirely. Contemporary accounts suggest this was the breaking point. Winter had weakened the army. Greek fire had destroyed their fleets. But the Bulgarians made clear that even if Maslama somehow took Constantinople, his forces lacked the strength to hold it or retreat successfully. The military situation had become untenable. By early August 718, Maslama's once mighty army was broken. Of the 100,000 warriors who'd arrived in August 717, perhaps 40,000 remained alive. And most of those were sick, starving, or demoralized. Arab chroniclers admit the disaster's scale even as they spare the details. The numbers tell a story no amount of theological interpretation could soften. On August 15th, 718, exactly 1 year to the day after the siege began, Maslama gave the order his pride had resisted for months: retreat. August 15th, 718. Exactly 1 year to the day after the siege began, Theophanes records Maslama giving the order to withdraw. The largest invasion force the medieval world had assembled was retreating in ruins. But the worst was yet to come, because the journey home would kill more men than the entire siege. The land retreat through Anatolia added casualties to an already catastrophic toll. Byzantine forces, emboldened by victory and eager for vengeance, harassed the withdrawing columns at every opportunity. Arab sources describe a nightmare march where sick and exhausted men struggled through territory controlled by an enemy that showed no mercy. The exact casualties from this phase aren't documented with precision, but chronicles make clear the army that had marched so confidently westward a year earlier now stumbled eastward as a broken remnant. The naval disaster would prove even more complete. The remaining Arab ships, sources don't specify exact numbers, but suggest substantial survivors from the various Greek fire attacks, sailed south through the Aegean Sea towards Syria. They hoped to escape the terror of Byzantine fire weapons and reach the safety of home ports. Instead, they sailed into natural catastrophe. Theophanes records a massive tempest striking the fleet near the Cyclades Islands. Medieval ships, dependent on favorable winds and lacking modern navigation equipment, were particularly vulnerable to sudden storms in the Aegean's island-scattered waters. The storm alone scattered ships and sent many to the bottom. But nature wasn't finished. Contemporary sources describe an underwater volcanic eruption near Thera, the island modern geography knows as Santorini. Theophanes' account provides vivid details. Pumice and ash choked the water, making navigation impossible and breathing difficult. The chronicler claims the water boiled around ships caught in the volcanic turbulence. Falling embers from the eruption set wooden vessels on fire. Volcanic gases poisoned the air. The turbulence from underwater explosions capsized ships that had survived the initial storm. The combination of storm and volcanic eruption created an apocalyptic scenario that both Christian and Muslim sources interpreted as divine judgment. The sky darkened with ash. The sea itself seemed to burn and boil. Ships caught in this catastrophe had no chance of escape. Theophanes makes his most controversial claim about the aftermath. Only 5 ships made it back to Syria. Modern historians consider this figure hyperbolic, likely Byzantine propaganda designed to emphasize the catastrophic scale of Arab losses. What's not debatable is the overwhelming consensus in sources from both sides. The vast majority of the fleet was destroyed. Whether 5 ships or 50 survived is almost irrelevant compared to the scale of loss. Arab chroniclers writing later had to grapple with explaining this disaster. How could the largest naval expedition in Islamic history simply vanish? Theological explanations dominated. This was divine punishment for sins, a test of faith, a sign that the time for Constantinople's conquest had not yet come. The alternative, that military planning had been inadequate, that strategic errors had compounded into catastrophe, that human decisions had led to this disaster, was too painful to confront directly. The numbers, debated though they are, tell a story of annihilation. Modern historians examining all available sources suggest the Umayyad Caliphate committed perhaps 200,000 men to this campaign, when counting both land and naval forces. Theophanes and Arab sources agree on the essential conclusion. Fewer than 30,000 made it home alive. It wasn't a defeat. It was the destruction of a generation of Islamic military power. Both Christians and Muslims saw the hand of God. They just disagreed on whose. Byzantines believed the Virgin Mary had protected her city through Greek fire, winter ice, and volcanic fire. Muslims interpreted the catastrophe as divine judgment for unknown sins or as a test of faith that had found them wanting. Modern historians see a cascade of military errors, technological superiority, environmental catastrophe, and strategic miscalculation. All 3 interpretations contain truth. When Maslama arrived in Damascus in late 718, he brought fewer than 2,000 survivors from the army that had numbered 100,000. Arab chronicles, usually circumspect about defeats, couldn't hide the disaster's scale. This was political earthquake. Theophanes and Arab sources agree on the image that symbolized Maslama's humiliation. He had fled the battlefield on a racing camel rather than a war horse. In military cultures where appearance and symbolism mattered intensely, this detail was devastating. Warriors who fled on pack animals didn't inspire loyalty. The sword of the Caliphate, the general who'd spent decades conquering Byzantine fortresses, returned to Damascus broken in reputation as well as force. The political fallout was immediate and severe. The Caliphate's prestige had been catastrophically damaged. The largest army the Islamic world had ever assembled had been annihilated. The treasury had been emptied funding this expedition. Contemporary sources document massive expenditures on supplies, ships, weapons, and pay for troops. All of it was gone with nothing gained. The military weakness that had been exposed was as damaging as the material losses. The Umayyad Caliphate, which had seemed invincible in its expansion, had proven vulnerable. A critical detail that Theophanes records helps explain why the disaster unfolded as it did. Caliph Suleiman ibn Abd al-Malik, who had ordered the grand campaign, died in September 717 during the siege itself. His successor, Umar II, was less personally committed to Constantinople's conquest. This change in leadership during the critical winter months may have contributed to decision-making paralysis. Maslama couldn't retreat without orders, but the new caliph wasn't providing clear direction. The result was an army that stayed in place through conditions that should have prompted immediate withdrawal. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing later but drawing on earlier sources, provided an assessment that Muslim historians couldn't dispute. He called the siege, quote, 11. Another chronicler wrote simply, quote, 12. These weren't just military assessments. They were theological crises. Islamic expansion had been understood as divinely ordained. Prophecies had promised Constantinople's conquest. How could this catastrophe align with divine will? The theological questions rippled through Islamic intellectual circles. If God willed Islamic expansion and the conquest of the city of Caesar, why this disaster? Some scholars suggested unknown sins had caused Allah to withdraw favor. Others proposed this was a test that would strengthen faith through suffering. Still others began to question whether certain prophecies had been properly understood. The defeat raised uncomfortable questions that would influence Islamic strategic and theological thinking for generations. The failure to conquer Constantinople, seen as divinely ordained, created cognitive dissonance that Islamic sources struggled to resolve. The largest military effort in the caliphate's history had resulted in near total destruction. Theologically committed leaders had to reconcile faith in divine destiny with empirical catastrophe. The intellectual and spiritual crisis matched the military disaster. Within a generation, the Umayyad dynasty would fall. The Abbasid Revolution in 750 AD, just 32 years after the siege, would sweep away Maslama's family from power. While multiple factors contributed to the dynasty's collapse, historians examining the period consistently note that the Constantinople disaster played a significant role. It demonstrated weakness. It emptied the treasury. It killed a generation of Syrian Arab elites who had been the dynasty's military foundation. The reverberations from those winter months outside Constantinople helped topple an empire. In Constantinople, there was only celebration and theological questions of a different kind. If God had saved the city, the Byzantine faithful wondered, why had he allowed such suffering along the way? Leo III would spend the rest of his reign wrestling with that question, and his answer would tear the empire apart in a different kind of war. When news of the Arab retreat reached Constantinople's streets in August 718, Theophanes records church bells ringing for 3 days straight. The city that should have fallen had survived. But Leo III faced a theological puzzle. If God had saved Constantinople, why had he allowed such suffering along the way? Byzantine sources describe celebration that mixed religious ecstasy with sheer relief. 3 days of bells marked the victory. Prayer services in the Hagia Sophia drew crowds that filled the massive structure to capacity. Processions through the streets carried icons of the Virgin Mary, thanking the Theotokos for her divine protection. The psychological release after a year of existential dread was immense. Constantinople had looked into the abyss and survived. Leo's political position was transformed overnight. The usurpation that had seemed desperate in March 717 now looked like divine providence. Victory legitimized his seizure of power completely. Questions about whether he had rightful claim to the throne were erased by the incontrovertible fact that under his leadership, Constantinople had survived the greatest threat in its history. Byzantine political chronicles document his consolidation of power as he founded the Isaurian dynasty that would rule until 802. Military prestige was restored after decades of defeats. The Byzantine Empire, which had seemed to be in terminal decline during the 20 Years' Anarchy, had demonstrated it could still defend itself against overwhelming odds. The victory had multiple fathers: Greek fire technology, the severe winter, Bulgarian intervention, Coptic defection, Arab mistakes. But Leo claimed credit for all of it. His tactical acumen in exploiting the Coptic intelligence and launching the decisive Greek fire attacks couldn't be denied. The material gains from the siege were substantial, if not precisely documented. Theophanes mentions vast amounts of abandoned Arab equipment captured after the retreat: siege engines, weapons, armor, camp supplies. While sources don't provide a detailed inventory, the sheer scale of the Arab abandonment suggests significant material windfall for the defenders. But the theological interpretation of victory created complications that would haunt the empire for a century. Byzantine religious tradition credited the survival to the Virgin Mary's divine protection. Icons of the Theotokos had been paraded on the walls. The faithful had prayed before sacred images, and Constantinople had survived. To the devout, the causal relationship seemed obvious. Yet in the years following the siege, the empire continued to experience catastrophes. Earthquakes struck multiple cities. Volcanic eruptions in the region, including the Thera eruption that had destroyed the Arab fleet, and suggested ongoing divine wrath. If God had saved Constantinople, why did natural disasters continue to punish the empire? Theophanes' chronicles from this period show Leo wrestling with this cognitive dissonance. The emperor's solution would prove as divisive as the siege had been unifying. By 726, just 8 years after the siege, Leo initiated the iconoclast controversy. He concluded that the veneration of religious images, the very icons that had been credited with saving Constantinople, was actually idolatry that angered God. Byzantine theological sources document his reasoning. God had saved the city despite the icons, not because of them. The continuing disasters proved divine displeasure with image worship. The iconoclasm that followed would split the Byzantine Empire in religious civil war for over a century. Leo's religious policy turned supporter against supporter, created theological ruptures that lasted generations, and arguably did more damage to Byzantine unity than any external enemy. The emperor who saved Constantinople from military destruction would tear it apart through theological innovation. Historical irony operated on multiple levels. Leo had saved Constantinople and Christian Europe. His tactical genius, Greek fire deployment, Bulgarian alliance, and exploitation of Coptic defection had achieved the impossible. But as emperor, he faced troubling questions about divine favor and human destiny. Within 8 years, this theological puzzle would split his empire in a religious civil war that lasted a century. The siege was over. Its consequences were just beginning. Modern historians rank the Siege of Constantinople 717 to 718 among history's most decisive battles. Not just for what happened, but for what didn't. To understand why, we need to see the 3 empires this siege created, destroyed, and preserved. The Byzantine Empire's survival ensured it continued as Western Europe's shield for 700 additional years. World History Encyclopedia and scholarly consensus emphasize this role. Byzantium absorbed Islamic military pressure that would otherwise have been directed at the developing kingdoms of Western Europe. The empire preserved Greek learning and Roman law through centuries when Western Europe lost access to classical knowledge. This cultural preservation enabled the later Renaissance when Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest in 1453 brought Greek texts to Italy that Western Europe had forgotten. Military historians calculating the strategic implications note that Maslama took 10 years to rebuild a force comparable to what Baldwin destroyed in that single year. The defeat bought time Byzantium desperately needed. It demonstrated that the seemingly unstoppable Islamic expansion could be halted. It proved that technological superiority and tactical innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage. For the Umayyad Caliphate, the disaster accelerated internal contradictions that would prove fatal. Islamic history documents how the defeat destabilized the dynasty politically and economically. The empty treasury couldn't fund subsequent military operations. The loss of a generation of Syrian Arab warriors, the dynasty's military foundation, weakened its ability to suppress internal dissent. Arab sources from the period show provincial governors questioning Damascus's competence. Rivals sensed weakness. Just 32 years later, in 750 AD, the Abbasid revolution swept the Umayyads from power. While multiple factors contributed to the dynasty's overthrow, historians examining the period consistently identify the Constantinople catastrophe as a significant accelerating factor. The military disaster demonstrated vulnerability. The economic drain prevented recovery. The theological questions about divine favor undermined legitimacy. The greatest military expedition in Islamic history had ended in annihilation, and the dynasty never fully recovered. The strategic shift in Islamic expansion following the siege reshaped world history. With Constantinople proving impregnable and the Mediterranean approach blocked, Islamic focus moved eastward. The Abbasid capital would be Baghdad, not Damascus. Islamic civilization would develop its golden age looking toward Persia and Central Asia rather than toward Europe and the Mediterranean. The westward expansion that had seemed inevitable in 717 never again threatened Europe on comparable scale for 7 centuries. For Western Europe, developing in comparative isolation, Constantinople's survival proved decisive, even though most Europeans at the time barely knew the siege had occurred. The Carolingian Empire could consolidate without facing Arab invasion from the east, as well as pressure from Islamic Spain in the west. The Balkans and Central Europe remained Christian, rather than coming under Islamic rule. Western Christianity preserved its distinct identity, rather than being absorbed into a Mediterranean-spanning caliphate. The alternative history scenario is stark. If Constantinople had fallen in 718, Maslama's army, or what remained of it, would have held the greatest naval base in the world and a direct land route into the Balkans. Nothing comparable to the Theodosian walls protected the developing kingdoms of Central Europe. The Byzantines had held that barrier for centuries. Without it, Islamic expansion could have proceeded into territory with no defensive infrastructure capable of resistance. Scholarly analysis consistently emphasizes this battle's macro-historical importance. It ranks alongside Tours in 732 and Vienna in 1683 as one of the decisive engagements where Islamic expansion into Europe was halted. Some historians argue it was more strategically significant than Tours because Constantinople's fall would have opened far more territory to immediate conquest. The siege proved enduring lessons about warfare that military academies still study. Technology can trump numerical superiority. Greek fire demonstrated that secret weapons can rewrite strategic calculations. Intelligence and defection can be decisive. The Coptic betrayal destroyed Arab hopes as effectively as any weapon. Nature plays no favorites. The winter and volcanic eruptions killed without regard to faith or righteousness. Alliances matter more than armies. Bulgarian intervention delivered the final blow. Morale and supply determine outcomes as much as combat. Constantinople maintained both, while the besiegers lost both. Leo the Liar had become Leo the Savior. The usurper who betrayed his allies had preserved a civilization. The man who seized power through deception had wielded that same cunning to achieve strategic victory. His legacy would be complicated by the iconoclast controversy, but his role in saving Constantinople remained unquestionable. Western civilization, sheltered unknowingly behind Byzantine walls, would continue its development. And history would record that sometimes, just sometimes, cunning counts more than counting. The siege saved a civilization, but it couldn't save the men who fought it from their own destinies. What happened to Leo the Liar and Maslama the Sword reveals the cruel ironies of history. Leo III's later reign demonstrated that military genius doesn't guarantee wisdom in all domains. Byzantine sources document his continued successful defense against subsequent Arab attacks. His Isaurian dynasty ruled until 802, providing stable leadership that helped the empire recover from the 20 years anarchy. But his legacy was forever complicated by what he initiated in 726, the iconoclast controversy that Leo began. The banning of religious images he believed constituted idolatry sparked a theological civil war that lasted over a century. Icons were destroyed across the empire, monasteries that resisted were suppressed, families split over whether image veneration constituted worship or blasphemy. The unity that the siege victory had created was shattered by Leo's religious policy. He died of natural causes on June 18, 741, at age 56, having saved his empire militarily only to divide it theologically. Historical assessment of Leo remains complex. He was undeniably a brilliant tactician whose cunning and strategic vision saved Constantinople. His exploitation of Greek fire, his alliance with Tervel, his use of Coptic defection intelligence, all demonstrated military genius. Yet, his religious policies caused damage that arguably rivaled what Arab armies could have inflicted. The emperor who preserved Byzantine civilization also wounded it profoundly. Maslama's final years carry a different tragedy. Arab chronicles document that he continued military service after the Constantinople disaster. He led campaigns, governed provinces, served the caliphate faithfully. But his reputation never recovered. The man who had been called the Sword of Islam, who had spent decades conquering Byzantine fortresses, who had seemed invincible, would forever be remembered for the greatest military catastrophe in early Islamic history. He died in 738, his name permanently associated with catastrophic defeat rather than earlier victories. The memory divide illustrates how history is remembered differently by different cultures. Western Europe largely forgot this siege. Unlike the Battle of Tours in 732, which remained in Western historical consciousness, Constantinople's 717 to 718 faded from Western European awareness. The battle was too far away, involved forces most Western Europeans never encountered, and didn't directly impact their territories. Byzantine tradition remembered it as divine miracle. Orthodox Christianity's collective memory emphasized the Virgin Mary's protection, the walls that never fell, the winter that destroyed enemies, the fire that defended the faithful. The siege became religious narrative as much as military history. Islamic tradition remembered it as catastrophic loss. Arab historians had to grapple with explaining how the largest military expedition in Islamic history had ended in near total annihilation. The theological implications, the seeming withdrawal of divine favor at a critical moment, created interpretive challenges that Islamic scholarship addressed for generations. Modern historical recognition of the battle's importance is relatively recent. Only in the past few centuries have Western historians fully appreciated the siege's macro-historical significance. Military historians studying medieval warfare now consistently rank it among history's most decisive battles. The scholarly consensus recognizes what contemporary Western Europeans missed. This siege altered the trajectory of civilizations. The universal lessons transcend the specific engagement. When modern military academies study impossible victories, whether the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, Agincourt's longbow triumph, or the Battle of Britain, they see Constantinople's shadow. The siege proved that sometimes cunning counts more than counting. That secret weapons can rewrite strategic calculus. That nature respects no empire. That alliances matter more than armies. That desperate defenders with everything to lose can defeat confident invaders with everything to gain. Historical analysis reveals patterns that echo through centuries. Technological superiority can overcome numerical disadvantage, a lesson as relevant in the age of Greek fire as in modern warfare. Intelligence and betrayal can be decisive. The Coptic defection changed the siege's outcome as profoundly as any battle. Environmental factors operate independently of human will. The winter and volcanic eruptions killed without regard to faith or righteousness. Supply and morale determine outcomes as much as combat. Constantinople maintained both, while the besiegers lost both. Leo saved Constantinople with lies, fire, and winter. He couldn't save himself from the theological crisis his victory created. Maslama lost Constantinople to cunning, technology, and weather. He couldn't redeem a reputation shattered by circumstances beyond his control. In August 718, as the last Arab ships vanished over the horizon and the walls of Constantinople stood unbreached, an impossible survival became historical fact. The city protected by God, or by Greek fire, or by winter, or by Bulgarian horse archers, or by all of them, had endured. Western civilization, sheltered unknowingly behind those walls, would continue, and history would record that in 717, 1,800 ships came to Constantinople. In 718, perhaps 5 went home. The numbers, debated by scholars, tell the story. This wasn't a battle. It was annihilation. This wasn't a siege. It was the day the impossible became real. Let's return to the numbers that open this story. In August 717, contemporary sources document that over 100,000 warriors and 1,800 ships surrounded Constantinople, a city defended by perhaps 20,000 men. Modern historians still debate the exact figures, but the impossible disparity is undeniable. Yet by August 718, fewer than 30,000 invaders survived to reach home. The arithmetic of annihilation defies belief, but sources from both sides confirm it. No single factor decided this siege. Chronicles document Leo's cunning deception at Amorium. Byzantine sources describe Greek fire's terror. Theophanes records winter's unprecedented severity. Historical accounts verify the Coptic defection. Sources confirm Bulgarian intervention. Natural disasters destroyed the retreating fleet. It was convergence, tactics, technology, weather, betrayal, allies, and volcanic fire that created impossibility. What makes the siege of Constantinople 717 to 718 historically unique isn't just the survival. It's how survival was achieved. Historical records show defenders used every possible advantage. Deception before the siege began, secret weapons during naval combat, alliances with recent enemies, nature's fury, and enemy mistakes. Maslama made sound tactical decisions by the standards of his era. His army was the finest the caliphate could muster. Arab commanders had conquered from Spain to Persia. Yet they lost to a usurper emperor who betrayed them months earlier. That's not just military history. That's the limits of power made manifest. The long shadow of this siege stretches across centuries. 75 years later, in 793, Charlemagne would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Western Europe. An event impossible if Constantinople had fallen and Arab armies had swept through the Balkans into Central Europe. 4 centuries later, the preserved Greek texts in Byzantine libraries would help spark the Renaissance when scholars brought them to Italy. 7 centuries later, Constantinople would finally fall to Ottoman Turks, not Arab caliphates, having served as Christianity's shield for 700 additional years beyond 718. The siege didn't just save a city. It preserved a civilization that preserved civilization. Both Leo and Maslama believed God fought on their side. Both were wrong, or both were right. Or perhaps the question itself misses the point. What historical sources verify is this. In 717, faith met faith, empire met empire, and the impossible happened. The wall stood, Greek fire burned, winter froze, Bulgarians attacked, volcanoes erupted. And when the last ships sailed home from Constantinople, the medieval world had witnessed what modern scholars now call one of history's most decisive battles. Not because of what was won, but because of what would have been lost. In the end, Constantinople's survival came down to a simple, impossible fact. Sometimes 20,000 can defeat 100,000. History proved it. Sources documented it, and Western civilization exists because of it.